Governor, I know you're on a tight time schedule. Thanks very much for giving us a few minutes.
Our pleasure.
In your Reagan Library speech, you said you plan to recommend your term, massive income tax cut. Mm-hmm. Speaker-elect Voss says that tax cut should be focused, targeted on those making between $20,000 and $200,000. Should the tax cut help only those taxpayers, sir?
Well, we haven't looked, and part of the reason why we're having this talk with Walker session is to talk about of our budget priorities, number one, which is creating jobs. What's the best way to get there? I believe putting more money back in the hands of consumers, more money in the hands of small business owners is indeed the way to do that. And I think one of the options is an income tax that I'd like to pursue. How big remains to be seen. And I do think Representative Voss has a good idea in the sense that if you look at the code, a lot of people don't know this, but if you look at the current tax code, not where we'd like to be, but where we're at, the disproportionate amount of the burden is in the middle. It affects the middle class. And so I think there's some real value not only for middle class tax relief, but also just in terms of the impact on the economy of putting more money back in the hands of people who are going to spend that money, who are going to fuel the economy, make purchases. I think would be a good thing for creating more jobs.
Do you plan to recommend a one-time or a permanent tax cut, Governor?
Well, I think any of the options we look at are going to be long-term. They're not just a quick fix. We're not looking at years ago there was that rebate check. And the challenge you get with that is if you get a rebate check or something like that, it really doesn't have the kind of economic impact that I think most of us would desire out of a tax cut or other actions, because people don't make a permanent decision. You might pay off a little bit of a bill, or you might make a one-time purchase, but you're not going to make a permanent purchase if you don't know that your taxes are going to be down at that level for years to come.
The potential surplus $358, how much money do you think you would have for a tax cut? Do you think you would have $300 million?
Possible. I mean, again, a lot of it depends on us. We're just literally for the next month going through department by department, each state agency, looking at their request, where we can streamline things, how we can put things in play. And, obviously we're hopeful because I still believe, as it was 2 years ago when I started, job creation is our number one goal. We understand the government doesn't create the jobs, people do. And so to the extent that we can do more things that help the private sector, people of the state create jobs, the better off, and this is one of them.
A new budget subject. Do you plan to restore state school aids to their fiscal 2011 levels, which would be prior to our current budget? Is that your goal?
Well, we haven't looked at that specifically. I mean, one of the biggest things, and it varies by school district, depending on who's still in contract. There's a handful that still are and others that are not, and depending on how much they use the tools available to them. But overall, when we put the budget together 2 years ago, the numbers that we got from the budget shop showed us that the savings potential from our reforms exceeded reductions in state aid for schools and all other local governments. Yeah. The question is, did they all use it? I mean, some would argue they used it and some, others didn't get as far, and some of it's depending on not just contracts, but how far they went in using the tools. But the idea there was to make a change that provided permanent savings, because those aren't one-time savings. The base remains the same going into the next biennium in terms of how much they save from those reforms. So the idea is anything you backfill on that is just add on money. It's not replacing something lost.
But do you have a goal, though, of taking state school aids above where they are now in fiscal 13?
Oh, I think, yeah, the question is by how much. Okay. It's not going back and backfilling in to where it was a couple of years before that, because, again, the savings meet or exceed that amount in terms of what's available. Again, it's up to them to use it. Yep. But in terms of going forward, that's part of the discussion I had, and I started having it back on November 8th, both at the Small Business Summit in La Crosse and then at one of the caucuses I met at here in the state capitol. Mm-hmm. I then talked about it about 8 days later at the Reagan Library speech as well when someone asked me a question about it, but it was because I talked about it before. And it really was simple. If we're going to add additional money, one of the areas we're considering is tying it into performance, saying, Dr. Tony Evers and I worked with a whole group of stakeholders on putting together a school and school district accountability system. Mm-hmm. New report cards have come out of that for each of our schools and school districts. We now have a transparent, objective, fair system by which, as a parent, as a public member, as an employer, or anybody else out there, you can look and know how well your individual school and school district are performing. Looking ahead, and we look at adding more money, I'd like to figure out ways, and we're open to suggestions of ways that we can provide an incentive for high-performing districts. It's not just at pure attainment, it's also at districts that show growth. Mm-hmm. That's part of the success measure in the report card. And then also look at ways that we can specifically help districts that are failing to meet those high expectations.
Superintendent Evers, as you know, has put on a new fair funding plan. Do you think you'll have enough money to put that in your budget, sir?
Well, there's some interesting ideas and there are things that I've worked with Dr. Evers on that I'm optimistic about, and we'll review it. But, a couple of concerns would be, just putting all the money back in from before, as I mentioned, doesn't account for the savings, both that have been achieved and the potential that's out there. So I don't know if it's realistic to go back that far, because then you're adding all sorts of new funding that's unaccounted for, unless you're going to drive down property taxes, which is an option out there. The other question mark, though, is in terms of just changing the distribution of the funds, whether it's existing or it's at some higher or lower amount in the future, is that's a very difficult process.
You've got to have real money to do that. The only time you can...
You really have to hold harmless, right. You have to make sure, there's 424 school districts. This isn't a Republican or Democrat issue. For a lot of Democrat lawmakers as well as Republicans, they'd be hard-pressed to vote for any serious change in the school aid formula, because, as you know, covering this for years, and I served here, if you've got a district where you've got 20 school districts in your legislative district and 15 of them do better and 5 lose, you're going to hear from the 5 that lose a whole lot more than the 15 that gain. And so I think any sort of reform in that regard is difficult, if not impossible, unless you can hold every district harmless. And that becomes difficult unless you put a whole huge infusion of new money in it. And I don't know, again, both parties, if the legislature is fully ready for that yet.
What about the plight of rural schools? Will there be anything in your new budget addressed just towards rural schools, sir?
Well, those are things we're looking at. Again, we've got a couple months before the budget comes out, but those are things we're talking about right now. How best to do that? It's not just about successful and failing schools, declining enrollment, negative tertiary aid. All those things are things that affect not just schools as a whole, but sometimes very different districts. You might have a rural school that's got low property value and one that's got high property value, both with declining enrollment, 2 very different factors in the school aid formula, but yet they each have their own challenges in dealing with that. It's hard, and some of it's going to be, I think, one of the areas we've got to hone in on as well is looking at additional incentives for new technology, knowing that as enrollment in some of these school districts declines, it's not just about piling more money in, it may be about giving them incentives to tap into technology that will allow them to coalesce around resources that maybe multiple schools share.
Online learning type thing?
Which, some we talked about for years, but again, I would just say anecdotally, as a parent, let alone as the governor, a few years back when we first started talking about this, it was a theory and it was an interesting concept, but there's a lot of hesitation about whether or not kids could learn in that environment or not. I've got one son in college, another son who's a senior in high school, Wauwatosa East High School, and for them, online learning, it's not just a concept, it's how they live. I remember a few years back when Matthew was going to one of his first dances and I was going to teach him how to tie his tie. I realized he already knew because he'd gone and found a YouTube video of how to do it and practiced it himself, stop, pause, And, it's just, even from a few years ago, it's a whole new world in terms of how our kids learn. And I think their expectation, we got to make sure the education system we have, whether it's in a rural district, a suburban or urban district, no matter how big or small it is, fits the 21st century where we're at. And we're not still living back in the 1950s in terms of the style and manner in which we provide our education.
2 more budget questions. In its November 20 statement, DOA listed potential income of $94 million in fiscal 2014, $125 million in fiscal 15 from a restoration of the estate tax, depending on what Congress does. Mm-hmm. Would you accept that $209 million potential tax increase, Governor?
No, the things we've looked at in terms of our process, and obviously a lot of this depends on what happens at the federal level because it's set to match, is that we don't want to raise the tax burden. We don't want to put when you think of a small business, a family farm, others trying to pass it on from one generation to the next, some real concerns there about the negative impact it would have on the economy and about people having those sorts of small businesses here in the state of Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. So those are all things that we add to our list in terms of things that we'd have to consider correcting depending on where things go at the federal level.
On your decision that the federal government should set up the healthcare exchange, does that signal that you don't plan to recommend providing more MA coverage with federal money, sir?
No, it's a separate issue, although some of the same concerns are there. I mean, some of the things that you've heard me mention in my concern about opting to have the federal government run the exchange as opposed to a state or a partnership exchanges, is that I saw with all three options legally, from a substantive standpoint, from the practical impact on the consumers here in the state of Wisconsin, there was no real difference. The requirements were essentially the same between state, partnership, or federal. And so my concern was if I didn't have any authority, if I didn't have any real control over it, why would I want to potentially expose the taxpayers of the state to any potential risk, even though there are funding sources now, as we know, you look at special ed, you look at other programs out there, those funding sources change. Similarly, separate issue, it's defined separately, the guidelines are separate in terms of when I have to make a choice on that. But when it comes to the Medicaid expansion, particularly in a state where we're already 90% covered, you look at some states like Texas where only about a quarter of the people are covered. That's a huge deal for them because there's a lot of people without insurance. We have very few. We need to find better ways to attack that. But one of my concerns, and the concern of a lot of other governors in both political parties, is under the Medicaid expansion, under the existing law, the Affordable Care Act, if we were to have to accept that expansion, we'd have to do a part, it would be 100% funded first 3 years.
3 years, yes.
90% thereafter. That's actually written into law. So we know right off the bat we take a 10% hit if nothing else changes. But the simple reality is, again, I go back to special ed funding. Even back when I was in the legislature, we grumbled about the fact the federal government mandated
X amount and never delivered.
And never delivered, never came close to it. And so I think those of us who've been around for a while who've seen the inability of the federal government, regardless of who's in power, to even come close to meeting those sorts of goals and targets, really raises some huge concern. When Medicaid today, even without an expansion, is already the fastest growing part of mine and just about every other state's budget across the country, without any true reform there. Now, if we thought between now and the point when we ultimately have to make our decision, if we felt like the federal government was going to empower us to really enact some true reforms to Medicaid, to put more power back in the hands of the state instead of living off these guidelines, that might be worth the trade-off. But short of that, there's some real concerns that we're going to get stuck picking up more and more of the bill in the future.
Do you think your current budget took $1.2 billion increase in revenues over 2 years and put it towards MA?
Yeah.
You going to be in a position to do that in the next budget, sir?
Oh, we won't be able to add as much. I mean, that was a huge influx. Remember, a good chunk of that was because my predecessor, amongst other things, took stimulus money to plug the Medicaid deficit as well as the school aid deficit. That's why part of the reason why we started out with such a hole. Yeah. We backfilled that in. We backfilled not only the hole, but part of the reason why Medicaid costs were so high to begin with in this last budget, the economy. You got more people who are dependent on government assistance for health care, for needy families, for children, more seniors. That pace may not be the case for the next couple years, so you might not have as big of an issue to deal with. And we put in place some other reforms. While we added more money to Medicaid than any governor in Wisconsin history, and more per capita than just about any governor in the country, we also put in place, I think, some pretty reasonable reforms. Things like saying, if you're in your 20s and you're on your parents have health insurance that you can get in the private sector, we're asking you not to tap into the taxpayers so that more money can go elsewhere. If you're someone who works at a business where they have health insurance, we're asking you to take that instead of tapping into Medicaid funds here in the state of Wisconsin, so that we have more left for people who truly don't have another option. Those reforms are seeing some real dividends, and if we continue to see those reforms working, that will lower the amount we have to put in the Medicaid as well.
Transportation funding. You indicated you're no fan of raising the 30.9-cent gas tax. Tolls, as you said, is a long-range solution. Right. You need federal okay. Yeah. Yet, Zoo Freeway, Hone Bridge, expanding I-3990 and the Stillwater Bridge. If gas tax is not an option and tolls are down the road, what are some other ways that we can pay for our transportation future? Well,
you've had there's a commission, a commission that the legislature enacted as part of the last budget. They put in, that we kept intact when we signed the budget. They put out a number of different options. I haven't embraced any of those yet, but we're looking at those. We're looking at other options even beyond just what we've heard them discuss in front of this Transportation Commission. And there may be some other creative ideas out there. But a lot of them, we won't be fully in position until closer to when the budget itself comes out in February to have sorted these options out. Because some require some looking at beyond just state government. Others require some real questions as to, we've got some ideas, but we can't fund a transportation budget just on a concept. We've got to have some certainty that if we move some funding around, that it actually would work.
Do you still like the idea that you recommended 2 years ago, that we take a growing amount from our sales tax and put it in the transportation fund?
I think it's legitimate. The question is whether or not the legislature would go along with that. They kind of tweaked it a little bit the last time. But if you look at sales tax, for two reasons, sales tax related to automobile related purchases. One is plenty of other states do that. We're one of the few states that essentially just relies on the gas tax and the vehicle registration fee. A lot of other states have a broader base for transportation. And secondly, even in the simple fact that some would say, well, if you take it out of GPR, you're taking it away from other programs. At least if we were considering to do it now, depending on the dollar amount, but we'd still only be backfilling in for what was rated in the past out of that segregated transportation fund by previous administrations.
Just two more questions. The John Doe Record show, you did hold morning message or communication meetings with county and campaign aides. And do you hold them now as governor?
I do not.
Did you hold them prior to the June 5 and the recall vote?
No, I don't have meetings like that, but there's nothing wrong with those. I'm presuming Jim Doyle did at some point in the past. Barack Obama, certainly there's plenty of evidence, did those sorts of things. Those are not, there's not a legal issue with those. Having campaign staff and official staff talk about simple things like schedule, so that you're not scheduling two events at the same time. Talk about staffing so that when an official schedule stops and a campaign one starts later in the day, that you're not just dropping off who's scheduling and who's with someone and so forth. And in particular, as you know, from the media standpoint, when I hold press conferences, media gaggles, go to events and that, nobody in the media says, I'll hold that question till later when I can talk to your campaign staff. Questions get asked all the time by the media that go between policy and politics and back and forth. And so what we did in those morning calls was, because there was so much of that going on, is try and sort out who was doing what and how. But remember, the key distinction is, and I don't know the rationale for why that came up. I wasn't even around the day that came up last Monday. I was out deer hunting. But it was completely different than what the individual who was being sentenced was charged with. So I don't believe it was brought up to make a point there as much as to point out that was different, and that those things are legitimate versus some of the other stuff that was not, which is stuff I've clearly pointed out I didn't know about, and had we known about, we would have taken the same action we took with another employee where that individual didn't work by the end of the day for the county when they were confronted with this.
So you've never had these calls as long as you've been governor in January 2011?
Call. I mean, occasionally you'll talk back and forth in the same way that, not at a scheduled call time, but there's certainly a sorting out. You guys have, for the last 2 years, asked questions that sometimes you'd ask some of my comm staff here a question that might be politically related, and they rightfully so say, can't handle that well if somebody on the campaign side answer that question for you. But the interesting is that's the opposite of the caucus. I mean, sorting out so that you don't have taxpayer-funded positions handling issues like that is the opposite of what happened a decade ago here in the Capitol with the caucuses, where, as I recall, not having been involved with it, but was the allegation was that elected officials used taxpayer-funded positions to directed them to do campaign work, work that was politically motivated on behalf of the campaign, as opposed to saying, no, we're going to draw a firewall. If a question comes up or an issue comes up that's not related to the official duties of the office, we're going to send it to the campaign side.
And then final question. Tommy, Governor Thompson always said, you win re-election in the year before the actual election. Do you believe that?
Yeah. Well, I also think that elections are about the future, not about the past. So the interesting is, I think a lot of our political opponents will want to rehash and refight the battles of the past. I think that politically that's a huge mistake on their part. And I think going forward, what people are going to see is that we're putting a focus on getting things done, not about having huge battles. We're focusing on our core priorities in this budget legislative session: creating jobs, developing the workforce, transforming education, continuing to reform government, and making investments in infrastructure. If we do those things, first and foremost, starting out with helping the private sector, the people of the state, create more jobs, if people see progress throughout 2013, I think that lays a positive foundation for 2014.
Governor Walker, thanks for talking to Wisconsin Eye.
Good to be with it. Thank you, sir.